Gerald Ashworth died on a Tuesday. He was 74 years old. He had built a construction company from a single van and a borrowed hammer into a business worth £11 million. He had a house with 7 bedrooms, a wine cellar his accountant once described as a second pension, and 4 adult children who, by every outward measure, loved him deeply. He had written his will 11 months before he died, and when that will was read, 3 of those 4 children stopped speaking to each other within the hour. This is not a story about grief. Grief, at least, is clean. This is a story about what happens when a father leaves everything, every last pound, every property, the company, the wine cellar, the house with 7 bedrooms, to a woman his children had never heard of, a woman named Miriam Cole, who had worked as Gerald Ashworth's housekeeper for 9 years, and who, as it emerged 4 days after the will was read, had known something about this family for a very long time. Let me introduce you to the Ashworth children. Richard, 43, the eldest. He had worked in his father's company since he was 19, first as a laborer, then in logistics, then as operational director. He had given his 20s and most of his 30s to Ashworth Construction. He had turned down 2 job offers from competitors out of loyalty to his father and what he believed would one day be his. Sandra, 38. A solicitor, not estate law, but close enough. She had been the one to find the will, the one to contact the executor, the one to arrange the reading. She had assumed, as the legally literate child, that she would be the one to administer whatever her father had left. She had been preparing for that role for years. Paul, 35. He had left the family in his late 20s after a falling out with Richard, which nobody would fully explain. He had spent 6 years in Australia. He came back 18 months ago, quietly, without fanfare, and had been slowly rebuilding his relationship with his father before Gerald's diagnosis. He was the one who had been present at the hospital the most. He was the one Gerald had asked for by name in his final week. And Ellie, 29, the youngest. She and her father had argued over something she refused to discuss with her siblings, and she had not spoken to him since. She almost didn't come to the funeral. She came because Paul called her and told her she would regret it if she didn't. She sat in the back row at the church. She cried harder than any of them. The will was read 3 days after the funeral, in the offices of Hargreaves and Knott, solicitors, at 10 a.m. on a Friday morning. The executor, a man named Leonard Hargreaves, who had known Gerald for 30 years, opened the document and read it in the order it was written. There were small bequests first, charitable donations, a sum to a former employee, a ring left to Sandra. And then Leonard Hargreaves reached the main estate. He paused. He looked up at the 4 of them, once, briefly, and then looked back down and continued reading. The entirety of Gerald Ashworth's estate, the company, the properties, the accounts, the contents of the wine cellar and the house, was left to one Miriam Cole, of 14 Fenwick Road, in full and without condition. Richard's chair scraped back from the table. Sandra set down her pen. Paul looked at the executor and said very quietly, "Can you read that again?" Ellie said nothing. She was looking at her hands. Miriam Cole was 61 years old. She had come to work for the Ashworth family 9 years earlier through a domestic staffing agency. She cooked. She cleaned. She managed the house when Gerald was traveling, which in his later years was infrequently. She was, by every account, quiet, professional, well-liked by Gerald's 2 close friends who had visited the house. She had a small cottage 15 minutes from the estate that Gerald had been paying the rent on for the last 4 years, a fact the children had not known. Sandra was the one who went to see her first. She drove to Fenwick Road the afternoon of the reading, knocked on the door, and asked, with the controlled politeness of a woman who is very angry and has decided not to show it, whether Miriam would be willing to explain the will. Miriam opened the door wider and said, "Yes, I think it's time." What Miriam told Sandra in the next 40 minutes was this. She and Gerald had begun a relationship approximately 5 years into her employment. Not romantic, she was clear about that, and Sandra believed her. Something closer to a deep friendship that had become, in Gerald's final years, a dependence. He talked to her. He ate dinner with her. He told her things he had told no one else, including, 3 years before he died, the thing he said had been, sitting in his chest like a stone, since his wife passed. Miriam did not tell Sandra what that thing was. She said only, "He wanted to make it right. The will was how he decided to make it right." Sandra drove home and called a barrister. The Ashworth siblings contested the will within the week. Their grounds: undue influence. Gerald had been in declining health. Miriam had been his primary carer in the final 2 years. The relationship, whatever its nature, had given her an opportunity to shape his decisions that the children had not had access to. It was, legally, a reasonable argument. The case went before a judge 5 months later. And that was when Miriam Cole's solicitor stood up and introduced a piece of evidence nobody in that courtroom had been expecting: a DNA test. Before I tell you what that DNA test showed, I want to ask you something, because this is the part of the story where I always lose the room. People split, and they split hard, and I want to know which side you're on before you hear the rest. Gerald Ashworth built something from nothing. He spent 50 years working. He had 4 children. 3 of them, whatever their flaws, showed up. Richard gave him 12 years. Paul came back when he was dying. Sandra arranged the funeral. And Gerald looked at all of that and left everything to someone else. Here is my question. Not, was Miriam entitled to it? Not, was the will legal? Simply this: did Gerald Ashworth have the right to do what he did? It's his money, his company, his life's work. Does a person have the absolute right to leave their estate to whoever they choose, regardless of who it hurts? Or do children have a claim on a parent's legacy just by virtue of being their children? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know where you stand before the DNA test changes the question entirely. The DNA test had been commissioned by Gerald Ashworth himself, 14 months before his death, with a private laboratory. The results had been held in a sealed envelope with his solicitor, with instructions to present them only if the will was contested. He had known this day would come. He had prepared for it. The test compared Gerald Ashworth's DNA, taken from a blood sample provided with his written consent, with Miriam Cole's. The result: Miriam Cole was Gerald Ashworth's biological daughter. Gerald Ashworth had an affair in 1962. He was 23 years old. The woman, a woman named Patricia Cole, was 21. She became pregnant. Gerald's parents intervened. Patricia was paid to leave. She was told Gerald wanted nothing to do with her or the child. Patricia believed them. Gerald was told Patricia had terminated the pregnancy and moved away. He believed them. He married someone else. He built his company. He had 4 children. He lived, by all appearances, a full life. And then, 12 years ago, Miriam Cole walked through his front door looking for work. And Gerald Ashworth saw his own mother's eyes looking back at him. He didn't say anything. Not that day. Not for months. He researched it quietly. He hired a private investigator. He confirmed what he suspected, and then he sat with it, for years, trying to decide what to do with a truth that would fracture everything he had built. He never told his children. He told Miriam. And Miriam, who had grown up without a father, who had been told her father simply didn't want her, had to decide what to do with a truth she had been living alongside for 9 years without knowing it. She didn't leave. She stayed. She kept the house. She cooked the dinners. And she and Gerald spent the last 3 years of his life doing something neither of them had a word for: learning each other. In the courtroom, Richard stood up and had to be asked to sit down. Sandra was crying. Not from grief, or not only from grief. Paul had his hand over his mouth. Ellie was the only one who didn't react. She was looking at Miriam, and Miriam was looking at her. The judge ruled that the DNA evidence materially undermined the undue influence claim. Miriam Cole was not a manipulative housekeeper who had exploited a vulnerable old man. She was his daughter. The will stood. Richard appealed immediately. His barrister argued that biological relation alone did not automatically legitimize a bequest that excluded 4 other biological children, 3 of whom had demonstrable relationships with the deceased. The appeal was denied. The estate transferred to Miriam Cole 6 weeks later. What happened to the family after that was quieter than you might expect. Richard stopped speaking to Sandra, who he blamed for not discovering the DNA evidence before the reading and preparing them for it. Sandra stopped speaking to Richard because she felt that was profoundly unfair. Paul called Miriam once, 2 weeks after the ruling. He didn't ask for anything. He just said, "I've been thinking about what it must have been like for you, growing up without him, and I wanted to say I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He talked about you the most, just so you know." Ellie never contested the will. When her siblings asked why, she said simply, "Because she deserves it." Her siblings assumed she meant Miriam. She had not said Miriam's name. The estate solicitor, Nora filed the final transfer documents on a Wednesday afternoon. She had handled 31 contested wills in her career. She had seen families destroyed over garden tools and costume jewelry. She thought she had seen every permutation of what money and grief could do to people. She slid the Ashworth file into the completed drawer. Then she paused. She opened it again. There was a note she had not seen before, tucked inside the back cover. Gerald's handwriting. Undated. 4 words. "Ask Ellie about Edinburgh."
Nora Adeyemi sat with that note for a long time. Ask Ellie about Edinburgh. Ellie Ashworth, 29 years old. Artist. The youngest child. The one who had not spoken to her father for 2 years before his death. The one who almost didn't come to the funeral. The one who had not contested the will. Who had said she deserves it without saying anyone's name. Sandra Ashworth Price was a solicitor. She lived in Edinburgh. Nora went back through the case file, all the way back. The estrangement between Ellie and Gerald, it had never been formally explained. Ellie had refused to discuss it. Her siblings had assumed it was something ordinary, an argument about money, about choices, about the specific friction that youngest children and aging fathers sometimes generate. But Nora was an estate solicitor. She had learned across 31 cases that fathers who leave cryptic notes inside their own wills do not do it accidentally. They do it because they cannot say the thing out loud. But they cannot die without saying it at all. She looked at the note again. Ask Ellie about Edinburgh. There was one more thing. Nora pulled the original will from the file, the will that had been signed, witnessed, and dated 11 months before Gerald's death. She looked at the witness signatures. There were 2, as required. The first was Leonard Hargreaves, the executor, expected. The second was a notary stamp from a legal office in Edinburgh, dated the same day. Sandra Ashworth Price was the witnessing solicitor on her own father's will. She had known about Miriam Cole for 11 months. She had sat in that reading like it was news. Nora Adeyemi closed the file. She picked up her phone. She did not call Ellie. She called James Lowe, the forensic accountant she used on complicated estates. She said, "I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me if the Ashworth estate is actually worth what we think it is." James said, "How quickly do you need this?" Nora looked at the Edinburgh stamp. Yesterday. Did Sandra know everything from the start? And if she did, what exactly was she protecting? Subscribe, because episode 2 drops and the second family changes every question this episode just raised. Drop in the comments, did Gerald have the right to do what he did? And when did you start suspecting Sandra? I'll be reading every single one.